Welcome.
Bienvenidos. Hoş geldiniz.
Willkommen.
So at the beginning of the webinar, there was a little questionnaire that we had up on the screen. I just wanted to find out more about your experiences since March of online teaching. So I was having a look at some of the results just now, and it seems that a lot of you are using Zoom, and a few are using Teams. You are using Teams. Some of you mentioned you're using other platforms, so it'll be quite interesting to know what platforms you are using. If you could mention in the chat anything that you're teaching on at the moment, that would be interesting to know. I found it quite interesting as well, your answers to question 3. So, do you think teaching will continue online post-COVID? And most of you seem to think no. Now, when I delivered this webinar last week, there seemed to be a kind of feeling that most of your students are much keener on face-to-face teaching. So perhaps that's where this thought is coming from. But yes, so really interesting to see your answers on that. I'm going to move on. So I'm going to just briefly talk about what we're going to focus on today in the webinar. So at first, I'm going to set up the context that we're all now working in. That's the background of the webinar. Then I'm going to talk about the potential problems with online teaching and what we can do to mitigate those problems. Then we'll look at the advantages, looking on the positive side of things. What are the advantages we can see from online teaching and how can we maximise those? Then I'm going to look at some tools you can use and trying to introduce a couple of new ideas potentially. And then we're going to look at some examples from On Point Digital. And at the end, I'm hoping there'll be some opportunity to share some ideas from your own experiences of teaching. So the background, as I said before, 2020 came around and suddenly so much of our lives have moved online. And I don't know if you're like me, but prior to 2020, I would do shopping online. I'd buy things on Amazon. I'd occasionally do a supermarket shop. But generally, most of my interactions were face-to-face. And suddenly this changed. So for work, the teaching I was doing at first, all of the lessons I was teaching were cancelled completely. Suddenly social life was not possible. And I found that suddenly people started inviting me to Zoom meetings just as friends to have a catch up. And another thing that I found quite interesting was exercise classes. So a friend of mine, when COVID started, she decided to do some kettlebells classes online, and they've been incredibly popular. And I have found personally that I've attended them far more regularly than I would have done if they'd been at a gym, for example, because I save so much time. I don't need to get a bag ready. I don't need to drive anywhere. I'm in the comfort of my own home. I have my own shower. Everything about it I found much easier. And that's when I started to think, okay, I'm not overly happy about everything moving online, but sometimes I can see that there are some advantages. So I found that quite interesting. Then, of course, in terms of education, as a parent, I experienced this happening with my son, for example. So he was 8 years old. He was suddenly at home all of the time, and we were supposed to homeschool him until the school set up a Teams account. And this was quite good for us because suddenly he was getting some live teaching into our home on the computer, and also the teachers were able to upload homework, upload tasks for him to do during the day. The same with my daughter. And one thing I found advantageous about that was we had a real clear idea of the work that my daughter, for example, had been set. There was no way she could say, oh, I've forgotten my homework, nobody told me, because it was very, very clearly on screen. And we also were able as parents to see what she'd done and what she hadn't done. So again, I could see some advantages there. Now, of course, for universities in the UK, I'm not sure what the situation has been like in Germany, but in the UK, most of the teaching has moved online. There are some very minimal face-to-face sessions, but I have quite a few friends that teach in the university sector, and they are delivering so many of their lectures and seminars online. And of course, the same has happened for language learning. Private language schools are offering online courses. It really has changed a lot. So then I come to the final point. A lot of you have been dealing with this situation since March, and I'd really appreciate any tips you could share with the others that have joined today. Any situations that you found that were tricky and how you solved it, or anything that you've been using that's been really useful for your teaching. It'll be really good to hear some of your ideas in the chat box. So let's think about the potential problems. Now, the first problem for online teaching are low-tech teachers. And I have to admit, I am one of those. In my normal teaching life, the most amount of technology I usually use is to play the audio, and that's about it. And personally, I find that anything additional to that increases my preparation time because I'm not particularly comfortable with technology. It takes me a while to get used to it. So we'll be looking at how low-tech teachers can adapt and keep their stress levels low. The next point is teacher talking time. So online teaching sets itself up very well for something like I'm doing today. So I'm on screen, I'm talking quite a lot, and you're all listening, which works well in certain learning environments, but for language learning, obviously, it's really not great because the only skill that the students are then practicing is listening. They're not activating their language at all. So we have to be really, really aware of how we can ensure that teacher talking time is kept to a minimum and students are able still to activate their language. And the third point, students disengaging. So I have to admit that sometimes I've been in a Zoom meeting, for example, and my mind is wandering. I find myself, I might be looking at my phone, I'm distracted, I'm not paying attention. And obviously, if you're a teacher in a classroom, you can immediately see some students are playing around with their phone and you can deal with the situation. But when you're teaching online, you can't do it. So it's really important to try and keep your students' attention at all the time, so that they can continue to learn and they're not falling asleep. So let's dig more into these problems. The low-tech teacher, so someone like myself. First piece of advice I would give is just use the technology you're comfortable with. So for me personally, that is Zoom, partly because I'm using it in other aspects of my life as well. So I've used it to socialise, I've used it for my exercise classes. So I'm already familiar with it. I know how to mute myself, I know how to share my screen, I know how to create a breakout room, and I feel comfortable with it. There's no point trying to learn something else when I can already use one particular platform very comfortably. Second tip, of course, practice using it before the lesson. So that you feel comfortable when you arrive, you know all the functions, and you've had a good look at it yourself beforehand. The next tip, I would say, obviously all teachers are different, and there are some teachers who are very, very comfortable with technology and are very adept at using it. So talk to those teachers, ask them what they're using, ask them to show you or give you some tips and advice. And if you're not in contact with other teachers and you can't speak to anyone in person, it's worth having a look at some of the teacher training websites. There are lots of video webinars. And of course, there are also how-to tutorials. So, for example, if you don't know how to use Zoom or you don't know how to set up the breakout rooms, Zoom themselves have recorded videos where they show you exactly what to do. And for On Point, we have a tutorial on Blink, how to use the online versions of the books, and that's on the website. So these tutorials can be quite useful. Now, the next point is about having a positive attitude. When I was preparing the seminar, I did some reading and I found a study that was conducted way back in 2008, so way before this situation we're currently in came about. And these people were looking at online learning back in 2008 and how it could be effective. And they found that attitude had a big impact on the effectiveness of both the teaching and the learning. So the people that felt positively about the experience got a lot more out of it. So even though it's hard if you're a low-tech teacher to feel positive, you need to try to be positive about it because it will help your lessons. And the last point is about the first lesson. So I always assume that my students will know more about technology than me, but this is not always the case. And you have to double check that they are all familiar with what you're going to be using, they all feel comfortable with it, and they all know what to do in case of problems. So, for example, on Zoom, if you have a student whose Wi-Fi isn't particularly good, you may find that they have to deactivate their camera, for example, and just be on audio, because that obviously uses less power from the Wi-Fi. So you need to talk these things through with your students on the first lesson and make sure they're all comfortable as well as yourself. So moving on to teacher talking time, what can we do to keep it to a minimum? So I think the big thing really is the use of breakout rooms. I know that not everyone is able to use platforms that have breakout rooms, but if you can, you really should use them. They're an excellent way for students to just behave as they normally would in the classroom. You can put them into pairs, you can put them into groups, you control when you bring them back into the main room. You can also go and listen in to their conversations, make notes of any mistakes they make, as you would in a normal classroom. It's really the best way to try and replicate what you would normally do. Another option is to use collaborative writing tasks. So you could set up a Google Docs, for example, and get the students to contribute a sentence each to build up a piece of writing, and you can correct it in real time on the screen. So it's actually quite a fun way of doing some writing rather than just having the students with pen and paper quietly noting things down. Of course, students can give mini presentations, so you let them take centre stage for a while and they can practice their speaking. And sorry, this bit's a bit covered up here, but another thing that you can use, I think, that's a really good idea, are video lessons. Students probably will get a bit fatigued by seeing your face on the screen all the time, and to give yourself a break, to give the students a break from that, give them some different moving input. I think video lessons are really helpful. I'll be showing you some on-point video content later in the webinar. And in On Point, there is a video lesson after every 2 units that's connected to the topics of the previous 2 units. So that's quite useful to use. And the last point, polls and quizzes. Like the poll I had, well, the questionnaire I had at the beginning of the session, if you can put some of those into your lesson, it forces students to be active and it gets them re-engaged with the lesson. So moving on to the disengaging students. What can we do to stop these students falling asleep? So my first tip would be, at the beginning of the lesson, share a plan so that their students know what they're expected to learn, what the outcomes will be, what the kind of activities you plan to do are. And hopefully this will get them interested, get them motivated, and keep them concentrating on what's going on. Second point is look at the camera as much as possible. This can be quite tricky to do because obviously you're sharing your screen, you'll be distracted by yourself on screen. But I think particularly at the start of a lesson, make sure you have that eye contact with your students so that they feel like you're really connecting with them. Now, of course, this brings me to one of the biggest problems with online teaching is that it's so hard to read the room. Normally, in your classroom setting, if you were speaking too quickly for your students, you would immediately feel that they were not understanding everything that you were saying. You would get a sense of it. And this is not possible to do online. So it's really important to keep your voice steady, keep checking back, checking that students have understood what you said, check that they know what you want them to do at all times. It's also a problem that students might talk over each other. So again, as the teacher, you need to be in control of this. Make sure the students are on mute when they need to be on mute, and then nominate individual students to answer questions. This also keeps them on their toes because they don't know when they're going to be asked. So if they've fallen asleep and their name's being called, they'll feel quite embarrassed. So I think if you do that regularly within your class, it keeps them engaged. Another way to keep them engaged is to invite questions in the chat box, and then you can keep an eye on what problems they're having as they go through. And if you've got some students who are quite shy, that might be easier for them if they've got a question they want to ask you. You can also ask the students to show any work. If they've written something on a piece of paper, they can hold it up to the screen, and make sure you give them feedback at regular intervals so that they know that you're aware of what they're doing. So the next point, as I said, I think because you can't read the room and you don't get that feeling of whether the students are understanding, you need to check back. Is everyone okay? Is everything clear? Do you know what you need to do? The next point, of course, be prepared for tech issues. This can happen. It can happen to you. It can happen to the students. You need to make sure they know what you would like them to do. The suggestion would always be try and rejoin the room, send me a message, whatever you expect them to do. Another point here, longer readings. I think certain activities don't really work particularly well for online teaching. So, for example, if you've got a reading activity that could work quite well in the classroom, it's probably not dynamic enough to do online. I think students really want to feel that they're gaining the most they can out of the online teaching, and set the reading for them to do outside of the lesson. They can do it as in preparation for the next lesson, and they can do the comprehension questions, and then you can go over it together the next time you meet. So I think it's worth thinking, we don't really want the students to be too passive when they're being taught online. And the final point here is, I think, use visuals. You want to break up the lesson as much as you can. Use your own photos or use stock photos. Get students talking about interesting images, and make sure you set regular speaking tasks in breakout rooms so that you change the dynamic of the lesson. So moving on to the plus points, the advantages of online teaching. What can we actually benefit from this situation? So as I mentioned before, I think you get more control of what the students are doing, particularly if you're using Teams or on-point online learning, because you can actually set homework through that, and students have got no excuses. They've been set the homework, they know what they have to do, they can log back on and check, and it gives you extra control of what your students are doing. Of course, there's also more flexibility. So it's like my exercise classes that I mentioned earlier. Attendance levels are likely to be higher because you don't have to get up early, you don't have to get a bus, you're in the comfort of your own home. There are fewer excuses for not attending. So you may find that you actually have bigger classes, which is always good. And geography isn't so important. You can have students from a wider area, perhaps, which can make it more interesting. Another point I thought about was actually the personality of the student. There are some students that find interacting face-to-face quite stressful, and this can really inhibit them and really demotivate them when they're learning a language. Whereas if they are able to join online and they may be able to interact with people on the chat box, it may actually really encourage them and improve their confidence. The next point is about your usual activities and games. I think this is also really important to remember. All your experience as a teacher, it still counts. You just have to be mindful that you may have to adapt slightly in order to deliver those activities online in an effective way. But your experience is still important. And my final point is I think this might be more tricky in Germany actually due to privacy laws, but you might be able to, with permission, record your lessons. And this is an opportunity for you as a teacher to have a look again, to look at your own teaching practice, but also to reanalyze your students' language. What are they making mistakes in quite a lot? What have they done well in? What might you want to focus on next time? So that's also something to think about. Going back to the usual activities and games, one of my friends who works in the university sector, he actually prefers online teaching at the moment because of the COVID restrictions. I don't know what it's like in Germany at the moment, but in the UK, when he does teach face-to-face, the students have to sit quite far apart and they're wearing masks. So any discussion activity is actually quite difficult, whereas online, he doesn't have to deal with any of those issues and students can talk freely in the breakout room. So moving on to tools to use. So because I'm a low-tech teacher, I tend to stick with what I know. And obviously PowerPoint is something I'm quite familiar with, and you probably are as well. As I mentioned before, there's also Google Docs, which can be great for the collaborative writing tasks I mentioned. So it's worth looking at those. Now, the third one is something I've been chatting about with some other teachers who've been using Padlet.com. I'll show you some examples in a moment, but it's basically a format online where students can add little post-it notes with their own writing, their own ideas, and it looks really visual and quite exciting, and it's something different to break up the lesson. Now, of course, there are also digital versions of a lot of course books, including On Point. Now, if you've got any other suggestions of things that you've been using successfully, please do add them to the chat box. It would be interesting to know what you've been using. So this is an example from On Point. This is A2, Unit 4. This lesson teaches there is, there are, prepositions of place and furniture vocabulary. So when you look at the screen, you can see that you've got all the normal tools that you'd expect. You can zoom in. You've also got audio that plays directly off the page. And your students, you'll be able to share your screen with students, and students will be able to see this quite clearly. So here's an example of what you could do, adapting tasks. So this is the first task. You've got a nice visual that you can zoom in on, and the task asks students to work with a partner, look at the photo and match the words to each of the items in the picture. So this is just to check what they already know and what they don't know, and they can collaborate. So at this point, I would put them into a breakout room and get them to talk about it together. Then you can bring students back out of their breakout rooms, and then they get to listen and check. So they get to hear a model of the language. And you can then individually nominate students to repeat the words to check their pronunciation. So this is an example of where you think, right, how am I going to do this? I'm going to use a breakout room. I'm going to bring them back at this point. Then I'm going to nominate. You just need to think a little bit more carefully about how you'll do it online. Now, sometimes it actually works better to have an online lesson. So I'll show you an example at the end of this lesson. This is the final task. This is where we want students to activate the language they've learned. So there is, there are, prepositions of place and the furniture. And they're asked to describe their bedroom or the room they're in now, or room in a photo on their phone. So if they're learning from home, they can actually move their laptop or whatever around the room and show the other student parts of their room, and they can describe the furniture. So which would be more fun than just talking about a room that's in your head. So moving on, this is an example of a reading lesson. So I mentioned earlier that this is the kind of lesson that I would set some of it for homework. So this reading task, they'll have comprehension questions for it and vocabulary questions, and I would set that middle section of the lesson for homework. Then when you join back with the students the following lesson, you can start off with the discussion point. So this is where I'm going to show you an example of using Padlet. So the question is here, how do you feel about high places? Have you ever done the things below? Where, when, what was it like? Gone to the top of a tall building, climbed a climbing wall, tried rock climbing. So I created a Padlet screen here, and you can invite students, you can share the link, and they can then add their own content. So they can each write a little post-it note answering the question. And then you could have a little discussion. So you could put the students into a breakout room with a group and ask them to ask each other questions about these experiences. So it's just a different way of doing it online. Then the end of the lesson, again, this can be done in a breakout room. You've got an exercise where they try to remember certain aspects of the text, and then they've got a discussion question about what they've read and what they've learnt about the person in the text. So again, I would put them into breakout rooms, have them discuss things. I would enter the breakout room, see how it was going, and then pick up on any language points afterwards. So this is an example of a video page. Now, these, as I mentioned before, you get a video lesson after every 2 units, and the topic is related to the previous 2 units. And initially, students get a discussion task before they do a little reading, and then they have the video content with some comprehension questions. So this is the initial discussion question. Write 5 things you enjoy doing at the weekend. Compare your list with a partner and explain why you like doing these things. So again, I would suggest you could do this as a warmer on Padlet. So you ask them to list the 5 things they like doing at the weekend, and then they can all see and share their own experiences. So I'm going to ask Brigitte to play the video so you can see the kind of content we have. My question to you, so students would have a comprehension question to answer several of them. And my question to you is, can you recognise anyone in the video?
What did you do last weekend?
Okay, I was at my friend's daughter's wedding at a beautiful place called Gosfield Hall. We were there for most of the weekend in a beautiful old building. It was built in the 16th century. We stayed overnight in these massive rooms. They were absolutely huge with really high ceilings. It was just a beautiful place, loads of parts to chill out. And also there was beautiful grounds with a wonderful lake and sculptures. And the weather was really good for the wedding. So all in all, it was a great experience.
Last weekend, I actually hung out with a lady who's like a mother to me. She's in her 80s, so I went to visit her and took her around the city, took her out to eat. That's pretty much what I did, and then went home and had dinner, late dinner, and watched a movie with my husband.
Last weekend, I was in Germany because I'm from Germany, and we watched the football match of Borussia Dortmund against Bayern Munich.
Last weekend I went down to my horse in Surrey and I had a lovely ride on the North Downs, Surrey Hills, which was wonderful.
I worked both days. I work at the zoo, so yeah, I had to go and and work, and so that other people can enjoy the weekend.
Yeah. Gosh, I think last weekend actually I had a chilled weekend, so I went to the gym. So went on, did some exercising just to make myself feel a bit better after a very busy week at work. And then I went out for a meal with friends on the Friday, so that was very nice. Went to a Turkish restaurant.
Oh, last weekend we had some friends come for dinner, so we cooked a big meal, and there were 3 extra children in the house, so there was lots of noise, and they played on the trampoline, we chatted with our friends, and that's what we did.
I went to watch Spurs in their new stadium, the new White Hart Lane. It's a new 62,000 seats capacity stadium, and I was lucky enough to get a ticket to the opening game.
Last weekend I played tennis and spent time with my wife, and went out for a nice meal, that sort of thing.
I think I went to the cinema, but I can't remember what I saw.
Last weekend, my dad was visiting. He lives in Greece, so he came and visited us, and it was actually his birthday. So we did kind of birthday celebrations. We went outside. It was really warm and nice in April in Switzerland. Sat outside, had a little stroll around the city where I live, and actually went to play pool in the evening and then to a restaurant.
Okay, I think some of you did manage to spot that me and my husband featured in this video, which is, it's not great to see yourself on screen, but this was recorded, I think, the April 2019 on a cold day in London, pre-COVID. But yeah, it was fun. It was lots of people were prepared to stop and chat to us, so it was a really good day. Now I've been looking at your comments in the chat box, so I'm noticing a lot of you are using Jitsi. Are you able to use breakout rooms in Jitsi? No. Okay, so that's not easy to use when you're teaching a language then. Now there's some other questions I've noticed about Padlet. Yeah, I think I've been using it on my laptop. I don't think you need an app. You could just, I mean, what I would do is I would share my screen. That's how I would use it on Zoom. So it's already set up the page and then invite students. You get to press a share button and invite them to add their content. Now I was going to ask, are there any other things that you've been using? Please do add any tips you've got in the box. And I'm just going to move on and show you what we've got with On Point at the moment. So these are the 6 levels, and at the moment we have A2, B1, B1 Plus and are available. A1 is about to come out, and then B2 will be available over the summer, and C1 is coming out November 2021. So yeah, soon there'll be a complete range. So I don't know whether you have any more questions at all.